listening to Money Matters with Mike. And now, our host, Treasurer Michael Gustin.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the November 6th episode of Money Matters with Mike. As Rob mentioned, I'm Michael Gustin, Treasurer and CFO of Cincinnati Public Schools. We have a really cool episode for you today. I'm going to do introductions, so starting from my left.
Hello, good evening. My name is Eve Bolton, and I'm a board member.
I'm Brandon Craig, board member.
Dan Hoying, General Counsel.
And we also have a guest today, which we'll get to. Dr. Howard Fleeter is going to be probably the bulk of our discussion today, but he's going to bring her in. But before we do that, did want to let Rob tell folks how they can participate.
Yeah, absolutely. If you'd like to participate today, we are streaming live to Facebook. Feel free to put your questions in the comments, and we will share them with the panel as we move along. We'll have different times during the program to ask questions of our panelists.
Rob, if you could go 2 slides. I do think before we get started, we should take a minute to thank the citizens of Cincinnati and the district. So we had our renewal levy passed very handsomely on Tuesday. So I want to thank the voters for their continued support for the district.
Absolutely.
I also had a school board election. So
Congratulations, board member Craig.
Congratulations to
Thank
board
you.
member Craig.
Thank you. It's a great voter turnout, which means our community cares.
Yep, and also congratulations to Dr. Moffitt, Mr. Jim Crossett, and a welcome to our soon-to-be newest board member, Kay Armbruster. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Rob. So tonight is going to be the first in a series of 4 episodes, our school funding series. And school funding is such a big topic, you can't do it in an hour. You can't do it in 2 hours. We're going to try and do it in 4. So I'm excited excited to have some experts here. So tonight we have Dr. Howard Fleeter. On December 3rd, next month, we're going to have County Auditor Jessica Miranda. He's still working on the guests for January and February, but we will go there. So hopefully, if you're watching it tonight for the first time, that's great. If you're watching it because a future episode told you to go back and watch this one, that's great too. But hopefully through these 4, we can give everyone a really concise but thorough examination of how schools are funded in Ohio, and specifically how CPS is funded. So I think the one thing I want to talk about is, especially going to tonight, is the history, is that things don't just happen, they don't just exist. Is things that are happening today are based on a series of choices that were made in the past. And so today we're going to welcome in Dr. Howard Fleeter, and he's going to talk to us about some of those choices that were made that get us to the school funding that we have today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about school funding if anybody's willing to ask me questions and engage in the discussion.
Awesome. So Dr. Fleeter, I guess the question to start with, I've heard you present before at some spots, but can you just give us a summary of your qualifications and what's taken you, what made you decide to become an expert in school finance? I'm sure it's not always the most popular path. So if you could just kind of give us a summary of how you've gotten to where you're at today, that'd be awesome.
Well, who wouldn't want to devote their entire professional career to school funding? I don't know. I don't understand your question, Mike. So I'm an economist. I was a professor at Ohio State in the public policy school from 1989 to 1999. And in part of my dissertation, big chunk of it was looking at school funding issues in California, where I went to graduate school. I'm from Northeast Ohio. I'm from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, suburb of Cleveland. So, for me to come back to Ohio and get a job at Ohio State was coming home for me. And, once I got here, I started looking into the school funding issues that Ohio was facing, because honestly, I wasn't paying attention to them when I was in high school. So, but, once I was tuned into it, I was fortunate enough that Governor Voinovich, who was elected governor about a year after I got to Ohio, had an agenda he was looking for somebody. He had 3 studies that he wanted to get conducted relating to education in Ohio. One was a governance study, one was a study of school funding, and the third one, I can't remember what it was, but he came to the public policy school looking for somebody that was willing to work on the school funding study. And so since this was something I was already investigating, and it was, part of my, research for my dissertation, and, I was a professor in a public policy school, and the governor of the state is asking you to look into one of the most important policy issues, I thought this is a great opportunity for me. But I was a new professor, and all of my colleagues said I should run the other way from that project as fast as I could. And I completely ignored their advice. And it was actually, in retrospect, one of the best, decisions I've ever made, because it's what got me out of my office at Ohio State and got me talking to actual policymakers. And that's what I've been doing, for my entire career, really. And it all started with that project. And so, what I did, and it took me almost 2 years to do this, was, I wrote a report that was 75 pages with about 50 pages of tables at the end of it, and it was called Equity, Adequacy, and Reliability in Ohio Education Finance. And I think that the governor's idea at the time was to try to make, when I started it, there were, I think, 3 lawsuits that were in their initial stages challenging the constitutionality of Ohio's funding system. They ended up getting consolidated into one lawsuit, which you may have heard of. It's referred commonly as the DeRolf lawsuit. Nathan DeRolf was the lead plaintiff. He was a student in Perry County School District, and there were actually 5 families that were the plaintiffs of record, and they sued the state, alleging that the Ohio's funding system, which was based on property taxes supplemented by state aid for each school district, they were alleging that it was unconstitutional. And it was unconstitutional because it violated the provision of the Constitution, which spoke to public education, and their, the way, the economists and lawyers talk about it, the issues at stake were whether, the funding formula was equitable, whether it was adequate. And then, in my report, those were 2 words that I had used. And then the other one was reliable, because it's got to work over time, which is what I meant by that. And so, the idea of the governor was to have my report, which, I came up with a number of different policy options to adjust Ohio's system of school funding, both at the state and the local level. And if his idea was that, those policy options, if implemented by the state, would make the lawsuit go away. If that was the standard, then I failed abysmally, because the lawsuit proceeded. The initial decision at the Supreme Court was on March 24th, 1997. I remember sitting in my office, reading it on my, very, what is now a very, very, very outdated computer that I had on my desktop in my office. And I'm reading through it, and sure enough, about 15 pages in, I find my name there, because in my report that I wrote was cited in the lawsuit. And, what the state Supreme Court concluded, after looking at not just my report, but evidence by, I think over 100 different people were deposed in that lawsuit. There were 3 main findings from the DeRolf lawsuit. And, one finding was that the system, the funding parameters in the funding formula that the state put together were inadequate, because they weren't based on a cost of what it should cost to educate what we refer to as a typical student, and also students who require additional resources because they've got extra needs. So those would be students with disabilities, career technical students, economically disadvantaged students typically require additional resources, English learners, transportation needs vary across districts, gifted and talented services vary across districts. So the idea is that for the, the clause that, was at state, that mentions primary and secondary education in the Ohio Constitution refers to a thorough and efficient system of common schools. Common schools are public schools, and thorough and efficient, is a fairly vague term, but the way the court looked at it, they said that it's the state's responsibility to make sure that the total resources that each district has are adequate to educate the different types of kids that walk into their doors. And that's the adequacy part of that
Okay,
decision.
just repeat that again.
Okay, so it is,
Just put,
and it
put
bears,
put that sentence on repeat, because that is,
it bears repeating, because I think, this decision was in 1997, right? It was 28 years ago, right? Which boggles my mind, right? But, nobody in the legislature was in the legislature at that point. I mean, a lot, this is ancient history to a lot of people. It's not ancient history to me because I lived through it. But the adequacy part of the formula is that the state's responsibility is to make sure that each school district has the resources they need to educate the different kinds of pupils. And what that means is that there needs to be some sort of objective cost-based methodology to determine how much it takes to educate the typical kid in each school district, and then how much additional resources are needed to educate kids who need more funding on top of that. And that's the adequacy issue. And the problem at the time was that the state wasn't engaging in a cost-based approach to this, that the legislature was literally picking, what we call the base cost, which is the cost of educating the typical student. Back in 1990, I think that was $2,517 per pupil. Okay. And that's kind of an odd number. And you think, wow, it must be based on something. Why wouldn't they make it a nice round number like 2,500 or something? Well, it turns out that the way the state did this before the DeRolf decision was that they chose how much money to allocate towards education. And then they worked their way backwards through the funding formula based on how many students there were, based on the property values in each school district. And they would then say, if we want to spend $2.5 billion, then that means we can spend $2,517 per pupil. If we're willing to spend more, then that number will go up. If we're willing to spend less, that number would go down. And so, that was, I described that methodology in my report as being a budgetary residual. It's what you get when you work backwards through the formula. That became popularly known as residual budgeting. But the idea was it's not cost-based. Okay. And so, what that meant was after the DeRolf decision, the state had to come up with a way to determine objectively how much money each school district would need. And we spent 13 years going through several different variations of the formula. Of various methodologies, trying to figure out how to get to that base cost. And so from the 1999 school year all the way through the 2011 school year, that's a 13-year period of time, we tried a number of different methods, all of which were objective, all of which were cost-based, and the state was making a reasonable effort to do this, and more money was going towards public schools as a result of this. However, after the recession, after there was a change in the governorship in 2010, we kind of lost the thread of doing that. And we went back to the state doing that residual budgeting method where they were just determining how much money the formula would be. So, I know that in 2014, they came up with a figure which was, I think, like a little over $5,000 per pupil, right? And then they were just raising that amount. They were raising that amount each year, right? And they were back to doing the same thing that they were doing. I think the number in FY14, it pops back into my head, I think was $5,732 per pupil. The next year it went up to $5,745 per pupil. Then it went up to $5,800 per pupil. Then it went up to $5,900 per pupil. Then it went up to $6,000 per pupil. Then it went up to $6,010 per pupil. Then it went up to $6,020 per pupil. So I'm not looking at this data, right? There's a pile of papers on my desk that has these numbers. I've just been thinking about this for so long that those numbers are just in my head. Sometimes I fall asleep thinking about them. So maybe I should have picked a different career path. But the idea was that we lost the thread of having a cost-based methodology to approaching the formula. We went back to doing what the legislature did before. Go ahead.
The fact you have these numbers in your head is amazing. Like to be able just to recite these is
No,
amazing.
it should frighten you because it frightens me. I shouldn't have some of these things committed to memory, but I do. So one of the questions I get about this, when people hear me explain this and they say, well, the legislature's picking these numbers, isn't that what we elect the legislature to do? Right? I mean, that's a fair question. It's a common question. It's a good question. But the answer is no. And the reason is because it goes back to that clause in our Constitution, which says that it's the state's responsibility to provide a thorough and efficient system of common schools. That what we elect, the standard for K-12 education in this state is higher than it is for the other services that are the state's responsibilities to deliver, because no other services are mentioned in the state constitution except for K-12 education. And that's the point about this. And why is that? It's because I think it is well understood that K-12 education plays a very different role than many other services. Not that those services aren't important. It's just that people understand that education is the key to people's opportunity.
And this
right?
is the one service that is in the Constitution. So
Right. It's the one service. So we spent 13 years making a good faith effort to comply with the DeRolf decision. We spent another 10 years not complying, not really going back to the way we used to do things. And then that put us, up to FY22, where we again implemented a new method of figuring out how to get at the cost of educating each kid. Before I say that, if people were paying attention to me, I said there were three main parts of the DeRolf decision. That issue about the formula and how the formula is put together, the adequacy issue, that's one of them. Another issue was that at the time, there was very little state support for facilities, and there were facilities across the state that were crumbling. We still have schools that are over 100 years old in Ohio and need renovations, right? But we created the Ohio School Facilities Commission as a result of the DeRolf decision, and we've spent over $11 billion of state money, and that is literally concrete evidence that the DeRolf decision has made an improvement. The last part of this, and I think you're going to talk about this in one of your future podcasts, is the property tax issue, right? And it's the over-reliance on the local property tax. That was the other thing that people know about the DeRolf decision. And I'll just talk about that for 1 second, and then we can get back to the formula. But over-reliance on the property tax was a very vague term, and it would have been nice if the court had been more specific about what they meant, because some people think that means our property taxes are too high. That's certainly what we've been hearing the last couple of years here. Other people think is that we vote too much on levies. We do vote on levies a lot. We vote more than any other state. That's because of how our property tax works. Okay, but the real reason, if you actually read the DeRolf decisions, and there was not only the original one, but 3 follow-up DeRolf decisions, and I've read them all. If you look at the examples that the court gave, what they meant by over-reliance on the property tax, that's the equity issue. We have over 600 school districts in Ohio, and some of them are wealthy, some of them are not wealthy at all, and a lot of them are in the middle. And the ones that have a lot of local wealth, it is a lot easier for them to raise the money locally to help to educate their kids than it is the districts that aren't very wealthy. So what the formula does is says, here's how much each district ought to be spending. The other part of the formula that's important, okay, is how that adequate cost is going to be funded. How much of it from the local school district and how much from the state. And the way the formula works is the less wealthy districts get more money from the state, and the wealthier districts are expected to provide more money locally. And so that makes sense in general. The details of exactly how you figure out what percentage of funding each district gets, that gets very complicated very quickly. And we've had last several years, the state share that the share that the state is contributing is at a record low right now. It's below, it's at 35%. It's never been below 40% as far back as my data goes, which is 1990. And the forecast is that next year it's going to be down to 32%. So the legislature, the last several years, has not been doing its part to fund the formula. Typically, it's been around 46 or 47% coming from the state on average, with the poor districts getting up to 90%, the wealthiest districts getting a minimum of 5 or 10%. But, there's a three-legged school of school funding, right? If you have friends that are interested in this question, or if you just want to bore people who aren't interested in the question, here's one simple thing you can say is, for schools to be funded equitably and adequately in Ohio, you need to do three things. One is you need an objective method of figuring out the cost of educating the typical student in each district. Then you need to figure out the cost of educating kids whose needs are higher, like kids with disabilities. Then you need to figure out the equitable way of splitting that cost, whatever it is in each district, between the state and the local school district.
Yep.
Those three simple things are what we need for our formula to be in compliance with the Ohio Constitution. But they're not really simple things when you dig into the details. So
I would say, yeah, the devil's in the details there. So
it's always in the details, right? But at this point, I hope, a little bit of a rambling discourse by me, but I hope, there's no simple answer to the question of how did we get here and what was the DeRolf decision. But that's kind of how we got here. The DeRolf decision was the response to what was going on in the 1990s. In the early 2000s, the state did a good job of responding to the DeRolf decision. In the 2010s, we lost the threat of that. And now in the 2020s, we're trying to get back to where we were 20 years ago, of the state seriously taking on the issue of what does it cost to educate public school kids.
cool. So let's that's probably a good spot to take some questions. I think that was a great quick trip through school funding. I'm sure people have some questions. So I'll start with the panel up here, and then maybe Rob, if you have some online questions, we can go.
A question for me, Howard, is well, first of all, thank you for that summary. That's as good as anybody's ever going to get. So I appreciated it greatly. My question really is, how does, and perhaps you can answer this, how does the politics in Columbus, how do the politics or the politicians kind of get their hand in this and kind of leave the avenue of objectivity? How has that been influential to your way of thinking?
So it's, philosophically, we can ask the question, is anybody truly objective, right? I mean, everybody's always going to have their biases. But if you ask me, the way I'll interpret your question, sometimes I get asked, what's changed the most? It's been 35 years that I've been working on this issue in Ohio. And, what has changed the most is that when I started, the legislature was largely supportive of public education. And even for those who we suspected weren't fully supportive of it, they were kind of afraid to say that out loud. But, this was the DeRolf decision was just as vouchers were getting started. Okay, it was just as charter schools that we call community schools in Ohio were getting started. We now spend over $1 billion a year on vouchers and over $1 billion a year on community schools. Community schools in Ohio are at least public schools, right? And we could have a long discussion about them. Vouchers, that's dollars going to private schools. And we now provide, there used to be an income limit on it, and there used to be, you had to actually have your kids attending a low performing school. Those rules have been changed. And now basically any family that attends a private school that accepts a voucher is eligible for a voucher. At higher income levels, that voucher is a lower amount of money. But we've now got, our main voucher program is called Ed Choice, and we now basically have a universal Ed Choice voucher program. And so, what I have seen is that the legislature is not as supportive of public education as they were when I got started on this and when they were at the time of the DeRolf decision. And that affects different types of districts very differently, right? Most of the charter schools are in about 10 or 15 counties in the state, which are the urban and suburban counties, right? There are hardly any charter schools, and there are hardly any private schools in most of the rural areas of the state. Those state, in urban areas, where I live in Columbus, I live within a 4-block walk of a complete set of K-12 public schools and K-12 private schools, right? And then about a mile from my house is a K-12 community school, right? So a kid on a bike could get to any of the three options for education from my house that we have. That's not true in a large part of the state, right? There's large parts of the state that rely on the funding formula. But even, in Columbus, the way we funded community schools and charter schools for over 20 years deducted money, for local money, from the public schools to go to the charter schools and to go to the voucher programs, right? That has now been changed. Those two programs are now fully funded by the state. But, there has been, some attrition and some financial impact on public schools as a result of that. And so, that's what I've seen happen over the years on this, is that we now have two well-developed alternatives to, traditional public schools, but private schools don't have to, public schools have to take every kid that walks into their door. That is not true for private schools. And I've heard over and over and over that they're from public schools that they have kids that got vouchers that get kicked back to them during the year because the private schools didn't want to deal with them.
Yep.
Community schools, the issue hasn't been that so much. The issue has been that for many years, Ohio was the worst state in terms of accountability for community schools. The largest online community school provider was literally a criminal enterprise. They were shut down by the state and forced to pay back money because they fraudulently counted students. Okay.
Howard, I think you should really tell us what you really think.
I am sticking to the facts. It is
Yes,
not,
you
it's
are.
called, I don't think if there's anybody left from ECOT, I don't think I said anything that they could
No.
disagree with.
Public
right?
record. Public
It's
record.
Public record, right? And it's a fact that they owed ODE, millions of dollars for this, right? So that's kind of the landscape that's in the background of all this, right? While it's the state's responsibility to fund, to create that thorough and efficient system of common schools, you've got these parallel, and I think the state could claim that charter schools are part of that system of common schools. Charter schools are public schools, right? There are good charter schools. I know people in my neighborhood that have sent them to them that they're, charter schools can fill a need for certain kids. Charter schools educate a high percentage of economically disadvantaged kids, a higher percentage overall than public districts, in fact. My issue is not with community schools as long as there's oversight to make sure those kids that are going there are getting a good education, right? The voucher program, that's different. The way it started, it was trying to help people, I think, that couldn't afford to move to a school district they preferred, couldn't afford to pay their own money to send kids to private schools. That's how vouchers started in Ohio. But the way vouchers are right now, it is moved from something which could arguably increase opportunity to people who don't have an alternative school that they can send their kids to something which is now basically a handout to people who already have the ability to send their kids to private school themselves. And that's a very different policy objective. And I think the legislature does not like it when I say that, but that is also a factually correct way to describe how the voucher program has evolved over the last 5 or 6 years.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So,
So, Dr. Fleeter, I think it's important, and one of the things you talked about in your 3 things that you can explain to anyone are 3 things that we should look at as we talk about building a funding for public schools, is recognizing that there are students who have extraordinary needs, and in some ways have more needs in certain communities these days, and that also dives us into that world of what's the purpose of a school, right? Because I do think that's the other part that is a struggle when we talk about school funding, is that we use schools in a different manner in some ways in communities where those students have additional needs, whether it's disability related needs, whether it's multilingual learners, whether it's students who are in economically disadvantaged communities, where their need for food, right? The need for safe housing or safe place to go to school, or safe neighborhoods, or safe place to travel after school, those type of things. have become more regularly associated to schools. And so I wonder if you would maybe speak a little bit to the other stuff that might be part of that formula as we think about what a school does that
Okay.
may not get factored in when we talk about
Okay,
what school funding is.
I'm really glad you asked me that question, right? Because it is, and we did not plan this out, right? I've only met you since we started on the show, but this is, I think it is probably fair to say that nobody in this state has worked harder over the last 30 years to try and increase funding for economically disadvantaged students than me. Right? That it is the one thing we finally got the state to authorize a study of how much it costs to educate those kids. And it finally came out a couple months ago, and it was supposed to come out at the end of last December, and it didn't come out until the summer, which was after the budget process was
Coincidence?
changed. And I was suspicious of that because it's, the average cost based on other national education research, and a lot of it done by other economists that I know, and I know to be, good at their jobs, is the average additional cost for an economically disadvantaged student is about 30%. And that's once you're above a certain concentration of kids, right? If you have a small percentage of those students, it's not as much of an additional cost. But once you have a certain concentration, it really changes the way that you need to approach education in that community. And again, I want to be very clear about this, that just because you're from a low income family, that does not mean your kids can't learn. What it means is that it is harder for them, right? Because they are typically not coming to school as prepared as kids from higher income families are. You can look at that if you want to look at the kindergarten reading, the kindergarten reading assessment scores that show you where these kids are starting. You can see it that there's a direct link from the KRA score to the third grade reading score. There's a direct link from third grade reading to middle school math and science. And there's a direct link from middle school math and science to high school graduation.
Exactly.
Right. And, this is a case where an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. The earlier we can get these kids and get them up to speed and up to grade level and on the same footing as kids that are coming from, more privileged backgrounds, the better it is for them, the better it is for the state of Ohio. It is, if you look at the proficiency test scores, almost every test score that you look at, there's a 20 to 25 point gap in the passage rate between low income students and higher income students. Okay. And this isn't about race. It's about class. Okay. And it is not exclusive to Ohio. It's a nationwide problem. And it is a tremendous loss of human capital for this state. Right. And, in addition to, this is the exact spirit of what, the thorough and efficient system of common schools is supposed to mean. And I will say, when I first started this, when I was relatively fresh out of graduate school, I didn't have any of my own kids yet. I looked at the school funding problem as we just need to try to get the right amount of resources to local school districts, through their local resources and the state aid, and then let them do the rest. And I have since decided that's the starting point. It's not the ending point. The ending point of all this is the outcomes, right? And until we are equalizing the outcomes, we are not living up to the spirit of providing a thorough and efficient system of common schools. So, the base cost is the starting point, right? And then the additional cost for the kids that need more help. That is the other essential thing that we need to do. And even if you get the base cost right, and I think we spend a disproportionate amount of focus on what the starting point is, we have to get that right. But if you just get that right, but you don't add the additional dollars to help the kids who need more help, we're still not doing what we need to do.
Well said.
So,
Just a comment. It resembles very much within our own district how we've tried to fund our schools. And now, probably almost 10 years ago, the district passed what we call an equity policy to try to get away from. It's very easy from the central side to fund schools in a manner that is, you have 200 schools. That means 2 math teachers, 2 English teachers, 1 librarian, and yet that is not necessarily, I think, what we're called on to do when we're trying to meet the needs of each individual school. And so the board passed an equity policy to try to get away from that sort of formulaic way. And sometimes people would say, a fair way of trying to fund schools would just be to give everybody the same, but that's not really meeting our students where they are. And so sometimes I can see the state trying to do that, but it seems to be almost a microcosm at the local level of trying to avoid that formula.
Right. What's just that? I have 2 reactions to that. If you want me to have a reaction to what you
Please,
just said.
yes.
One is there's a difference between equity and equality.
Yeah.
Right. Equality is sameness and equity is fairness. Right. And so what you're describing is a fairness policy. Right. And I think that is consistent with what I just said about trying to give more resources to the kids who need more. Right. And the other thing is that, how we construct the state funding formula. Right. I mean, the way it looks right now, it's, people out there who don't want me to get in the weeds of this, it's kind of an inputs-based approach to this, where you look at what the class sizes should be, how many teachers you need, how many additional support personnel you need. There's 15 or 16 different categories that get funded that are based on the characteristics of each school district. That's the mechanism for figuring out the state's objective way of saying you need at least this much money in total. That is not necessarily a prescription for saying you need to run your school district according to the formula. That's a very different thing, right? There's nothing in the formula that says you need to have this exact class size in grades in 3rd grade and this class size in 8th grade, right? The formula needs a mechanism of saying, well, this is how much on average we think it's going to take a district with your characteristics to do the job. But each local school district knows better than anybody in Columbus, than me, than anybody else. You know your kids, you know your families, you know your staffing, you know the geographic configuration of your district. You all know that better than anybody. And it is your job to take the resources that the state gives you and figure out how to best use them to educate your kids. And so the funding formula is a model for figuring out the dollars, but that is not a prescription that you have to live by to make sense that you have to do it this way. Because I can guarantee you that what is right for one district will not necessarily be right for another district, because each one of these districts has it has an individual mixture of kids, an individual set of objectives from the community that's around it, and so each district. That's why we have local school districts. If we were just going to say to everybody, "This is how you have to do it," we should just have one big school district and be done with it. And that way, I would be out of a job and I could finally retire. But we're not. There's a reason why we do this at the local level, because local people know better how to provide services than somebody sitting in an office, whether it's in the State House in Ohio, whether it's me here, whether it's somebody in some think tank in Washington, D.C. You all know better than we do how to best educate your kids.
Yeah, you've got some great quotes we'll cut out reviews. That's a great one, local districts. Rob, do we have any questions from online?
Yeah, so our first question is are there examples of states that do this well?
So I get that question all the time, right? And every state except for Hawaii, oddly, which is one giant school district, even though it's a bunch of individual islands, right? Every state has local school districts. And so every state struggles with the equity issue and every state struggles with the adequacy issue. And there are different ways of figuring out what it costs to educate a kid, and different states do different things, right? And so none of them is perfect. They all have their pros and cons. We've used an outcomes-based approach like some states do, where you say, let's look at the school districts that are doing a good job and then figure out what they spend and then use that as the starting point for everybody else. That's a way to do it. You could do the input-based approach that says, okay, what are the components of a quality education? What do they cost? You add them all up and you can do that. It seems that that's the more common way. That's the way we do it. There's some specific differences that some states do. But I think the way Ohio does it, we're very much in the mainstream of how other states do it. The issues with figuring out the state and local share, that varies a lot from state to state. And that's the kind of thing, when I get that question, is there some other state that does this well? My answer is there's states that do it well for their circumstances, but that what they do does not necessarily transfer to Ohio. And I know you're going to talk about property taxes, in a future episode, but I'll just say one brief thing here. Ohio's property tax works differently than any other state's. Okay, and so we have something called House Bill 920. You're going to hear a lot about this. We've got 11 million people in this state. If there's more than, a few thousand that really understand it, I'd be surprised. It's very complicated. But essentially, all locally voted levies will not raise 1 penny more after we have a property reappraisal than they did before that property was reappraised. Okay, and there is no other property tax in the state that works that way. Other states have different restrictions on property taxes to try and keep costs under control for homeowners, but nobody has that one. And so every state does some sort of variation when they figure out the local share of looking at the property wealth of the school district, sometimes the income levels of the people who live in each school district. Everyone they start with what are the property values. That's where you see the wealthy places versus the poor places. In Ohio, we've got a bigger disconnect than any other state between the property value that you have and the amount of revenue that a school district will get. And that's because of House Bill 920, making sure that your voted levies don't raise any more money as property values go up. And so this is, on the adequacy issue, we can learn a lot from what other states do, and we have looked at them and we've gone from one approach to another. And, most states do something, some states more complicated, some states less complicated, some version of what we do with the adequacy issue of looking at what it costs to educate different kinds of kids. On the state share issue, we're on our own, because we cannot adopt a strategy that might work in another state because our property tax works so differently.
That's a great segue. Rob, I actually want to make sure we get to these slides. So I'm gonna tax our producer Rob here. So Dr. Fleeter, I think in September, you publish a newsletter, I guess we call it, called On the Money. And there's two graphs in there, and I'll share these at a board meeting just for a wider audience. But it's comparing, I guess this is fiscal year 02, and it's ranking all the states by not only total revenue per pupil, but state share and local share.
Right.
And then if you go to the next slide, Rob, we get the fiscal year, what is that, 25? And I put some little arrows here. Add some little arrows here for the.
All right, that's good, because
please,
I wrote that
explain
stuff
for us.
down right here. Now I can just look at the screen. So,
Please explain to folks what this graph is telling us.
okay. So what this is telling you is when when you look at total spending from 2002 to 2023, even though Ohio's spending per pupil has gone up, our rank among the states has fallen from 15th to 20th. Okay, so that's one thing, right? Then when you look at the composition of where the revenue comes from, that the revenue is what allows everybody to spend. When you look at that, our state revenue ranking in revenue per pupil has gone from 24th to 41st, while our local revenue has gone up, but only from 10th to 12th, right? So what has happened is, the state's contribution to total school funding has fallen per pupil and has fallen relative to the rest of the country, right? And our local revenue has gone up, but we've also even our local revenue has not kept pace with the rest of the country. When you add it all up, our spending has fallen, right? So we're losing ground in terms of what we spend and the revenue that we get from the state over, this 21 year period of time from 2002 to 2023. And then you don't have the slides up, but I also looked at it, they've got, I get this data from the, U.S. Census Bureau. They have something called the Census of Local Governments, and it's got a lot of really interesting information if you're out there about different, revenue and expenditure figures across the 50 states. And they've got another table which looks at the state and local share by percentage. And in 2002, the state share of K-12 funding, Ohio was 35th. And by 2023, we'd fallen from 35th to 45th. And so, it's not, Ohio, for some context, Ohio is a relatively high local tax state, right? When I first started looking at this, when I was teaching at OSU and I was teaching a state and local government finance class, and Ohio was, typically in the top 12 to 15 in terms of our taxes, per capita or as a percent of income. We're typically in the top third of local taxes, but we're in the bottom third of state taxes. So if we'd be 15th on local taxes, we'd be about 35th on state taxes. When you add it all up, state and local put together, we're always in the middle. We're always around 25th. Okay. What has happened, that same pattern has generally been true for education, where we're around, we're 15th to 20th in local revenue, and we've been around 30th in state revenue. What's been happening lately is that schism has been widening. Our local tax ranking is now in the top 10, and our state tax ranking is around 43rd or 44th. Okay, when it comes to education, right, we've gone from, again, our state share has fallen from 24th to 41st, right? So it's, this is a problem that's not, it shows up in the context of K-12 education, but higher ed's also been suffering from a decline in state resources, right? And for higher ed, what's the safety valve if your state aid doesn't keep up? Its tuition goes up. At the local level, what happens if your state aid doesn't go up? It's your property taxes go up. And so that was the context of that On the Money article I wrote, was just showing how Ohio's ranking has changed compared to other states and has changed as a percentage and has changed in per pupil terms, right? And so the state, again, they keep saying we're spending more money than ever on public education, which is true, but they're not keeping pace with inflation. And on a per pupil level, they're only barely keeping pace with inflation, right? And so they keep seeing the total dollars going up, but it's only, again, it's everything's more expensive now than it was in 2002. And so even though it's gone up, it hasn't gone up in a way that has allowed school districts to do the job that they need to do in 2023, which is different than it was in 2002, or in 1990 when I first started looking at these things.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to think of the context of the conversation. So yes, is the state spending more money on education than before? Of course, but just our ranking across all the states, we've dropped from 15th to 25th, over that 20 plus year period, and then you parse out when the state says they're spending money on K-12, they're including the vouchers as well.
Right.
So that's an important thing. And it's very specific words are spending money on K-12 public education. That's where you get to us.
Right.
So just one last question for you, Dr. Fleeter, tonight is, if you had a magic wand, if you were governor, president of the Senate, all those things, if you had the magic wand to change Ohio school funding, what would you do?
Okay. I would fully fund the formula. That was one thing that, I feel like I've been talking for the last hour and I haven't gotten through everything I feel like needs to be said here. Very briefly, I mentioned that the state share in the formula has fallen and it's now 35% and it's going to be 32% next year and it's never been below 40% before. When we implemented the new funding formula in FY22, the state has not been keeping up with adjusting the data so that the adequate amount of money gets adjusted each year. But they have adjusted the data on property values and income, which they use to figure out the state share. And when they adjust, as property values go up and as income levels go up, the state share has been going down. And to counterbalance that, you need to recognize that the cost of educating kids goes up, but that cost has only gone up, at one point, the first year was the 22 school year, and then the cost stayed the same in 23. We updated all the data so that it was current in 24, and the state share went up when we did that. And it has since fallen in FY25 and this year FY26, and it's projected to fall again in FY27. So if I had a magic wand, the first thing that I would do would be to fully fund the formula. And I would say, even though you didn't ask me, how would I do that? I would say I would roll back the flattening of the income tax that the state just did. We're now next year going to have a flat rate, 2.75% interest income tax rate. Back in 2005, we had 9 brackets and the top one was 7.5%. We've slowly been reducing the rates, but in the last couple of years, we've flattened them. We just gave, in the last 3 years, given over $2 billion tax reduction to the wealthiest people in this state on the state income tax. And then the state is turning around and saying the school funding formula is too expensive. We can't afford it. Okay. We can't afford it because of decisions they've made.
Exactly.
Okay, that leave them with not enough money.
And
So
that's coming full circle. Yes, all the
that's
places
the
we're at
first thing.
today
That's
is
the
because of
first.
decisions we made. Yeah.
That would be the first thing that I would do. The next thing that I would do would be to have the state spend some money on property tax relief for people so that it doesn't get funded on the backs of schools and other local governments, because property taxes have been rising in a lot of places, and that is a very real problem for a lot of people. And the state is now, with what's on the table, they are, assuming the Senate passes something called House Bill 186. The House version of that is going to have over $400 million, which will go to school district, which will lower people's taxes and will hold school districts harmless until their next reappraisal. And that's a good thing that the state has done. And I would do more things like that. The last thing that I would do, if there's people out there that have their kids in private schools and you're listening to this, and I would dial back the voucher program. I think that that giving vouchers to people of any income level is something that the state does not need to do. When we expanded vouchers a couple years ago, we went from, I'm going to have to look this up because these numbers I can't remember, but in the Ed Choice expansion voucher program, which is the one that had an income limit on it, in the 23 school year, when it had an income limit, it cost $124 million. In FY24, the next year when they got rid of the income limit, it went up to $405 million, which is increasing by more than 3 times. And I got the data from the Ohio Department of Education, and they showed that 96% of the people who got vouchers already had their kids attending private schools. And so I can live with the voucher program when it's a way that's increasing opportunity for kids, but if it's just a handout to people who already have their kids in private schools, I would dial that back. And you could use some of that money to put into funding for, let's say, economically disadvantaged students.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much tonight. We could probably talk about this all night. I would be all about that, but
I can talk about this all night, so don't say that. Right?
We could go for another couple hours, but I'm told we have to kind of wrap this up in a few minutes. So thank you so much for your time tonight, Dr. Fleeter. We're going to transition to something a little totally different. So part of, we talked a lot about Ohio at the state level, and that was great. I want to talk a little bit about how CPS was funded. And so we have our Chief Legal Counsel, Dan Hoying, here, who is a bit of our CPS local history buff.
First time caller, long time listener.
That's
right.
Yes, he is probably the closest thing we have to our local historian. But Dan's put together a nice presentation. So take it
Well,
away, sir.
Well, I really enjoyed.
I can bow out now. So
Really enjoyed listening to
Thank
Dr.
you.
Fleeter.
Thank
Just
you,
a
Dr.
phenomenal knowledge about state. Thank you very much.
all
for
right, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. Okay, so
terrific.
Thank you so much.
bye-bye.
Like,
So just a diversion, a really brief diversion into not necessarily the way schools are currently funded, but Mike asked me to put some a couple of slides together about our history at CPS of being funded, and he didn't give me any parameters, so I went all the way back to to the very founding of CPS and. Talked, just to kind of put some parameters of the timeline we're talking about. Ohio was funded as a part of the Northwest Territory, and the founding and governing document of the Northwest Territory was the Northwest Ordinance, enacted even before the U.S. Constitution. And just full of high-minded ideals about how Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin and Michigan would be founded and governed, including that education would be critical to this new territory. The Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance says, knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And so we're the legacy of that. Cincinnati was founded just a year later as the pioneers are coming down from Pittsburgh, down the Ohio River, and stop in Cincinnati at the mouth of the Mill Creek and Licking River and found Cincinnati. The Ohio Constitution, 15 years later, has again all of those same high-minded ideals about what education, that education will be a part of the state. So moving on, the first start of Cincinnati Public was two very generous gifts of generous Cincinnatians. The first gift was in 1824. Thomas Hughes is a cobbler, a shoemaker. Relatively modest means, I think. This was not Phil Knight. This was, a pretty modest shoemaker who lived alone. The story is he lived with a pony, a dog, and some chickens, had no children, and decided 3 weeks before his death that he would leave all of his property and all of his money to the city of Cincinnati for the education of poor children in Cincinnati. This was not a gift to Yale and Harvard. This was for poor children in Cincinnati to be educated. And what's maybe even more important than his gift is that it inspired his good friend and the executor of his estate, William Woodward, married to Abigail Cutter, and it inspired them to make a gift. And they started Woodward High School during their lifetime. So he donates a substantial amount of money. Woodward was a surveyor, probably of greater means, surveying being a really important profession in the founding of a city. And so he starts the Woodward Free Grammar School. There's a trust document that you can still find online, and it's just fascinating to read because it talks about how this is going to be a school that, first of all, that orphans can attend for free, children without parents attend for free, and others provide essentially the reasonable tuition that they can pay. So it's again for poor children. Talks about how the school shall be open to all children without regard to religious creed. So this is really a public school. It's the first public school west of the Allegheny Mountains. There's a good argument that it may be the first school in Cincinnati, although my alma mater, St. X High School, claims to have been founded 7 days earlier on October 17th, 1831. So that's still under research. That's right. The last thing is Cincinnati's common schools. So these are two schools that are privately funded, and in 1829, Cincinnati starts its first common schools. This is what Dr. Fleeter talked about. The state allowed communities to do a half-mill property tax, and schools have been funded with property taxes ever since. Largely thought that that half mil was not sufficient to be able to pay for building schools and buying land and paying teacher salaries. Townships, when they were surveyed, had a section set aside that was supposed to be for schools. It was called the 16th section, and that was for schools. But a lot of townships would sell or lease that off to make money for the township, and then find themselves without any land for building public schools. So these are kind of the three ways that public schools are starting in Cincinnati. And to wrap it up, in 1851, so about 25 years later, the three merged. And so there's an agreement wherein the Common Schools of Cincinnati merged with the Hughes Trust and the Woodward Trust. And this is really the formation or the future of Cincinnati public schools. They even started to divide up neighborhood boundaries. So the neighborhood boundaries for Hughes on the west and Woodward on the east was largely thought Vine Street, but it's Race Street originally in the school district. So that's how they started. That was the first superintendent was appointed at that point too, Nathan Guilford, and we went on from there. There's lots of other eras of Cincinnati school building and funding. I love this era, the golden age, where you've got Hughes and Western Hills and Withrow with its bridge and clock tower built, the dome at Walnut Hills, that this period of like the first 30 or 35 years of the 1900s is just cathedrals of education being built all over the city. So that's a great era. And there's a separate story about how Cincinnati and especially its Black residents built schools to educate Black students and how those were folded into the school district. And of course, more recently, the Facilities Master Plan, in which really revolutionized and rebuilt or built anew at almost every school district, every school within the district. So, I was trying to think of whether there's any kind of theme to pull it together, and I really think it's that the school district has been the beneficiary of the generosity of Cincinnatians, and that's all the way back from the shoemaker who donated his estate to Cincinnatians this week, approving the levy and providing for a decade more of free or very low cost and high quality preschool and early education for our families, something not every community in Ohio has. So it feels like Cincinnatians will insist on high quality education for its citizens, even if we have to pay for it ourselves. So thanks to Cincinnati, and thanks, Mike, for having me on tonight.
No, this was great, Dan. I love the slide. If you go back one to, I guess we call it the golden, or two, I guess, the golden age of all these buildings, and just, I know you and I have talked about it, but these, like you said, these monuments to education that are still in our community, and you see I see probably one of these every day driving to work.
That's right.
It's a great reminder of how people have invested.
Yeah.
And people have chosen year over year to support the schools.
And with the Facilities Master Plan too, the big decisions. Do you renovate? Do you build anew? Because it's a lot cheaper to build anew, even if it means tearing down these great monuments. And I can easily recall that people frankly said, you cannot destroy these buildings. These are iconic representatives of who we are. And when you think of that history, and I know Dan and I like to try to figure out when the third century begins, whether it's 1825 with the half mill, or is it 1827, with the schools being formulated. The real issue for me is when you look back and you think of the cobbler, or you think of all this stuff, no, we could not possibly sign a letter saying no to diversity and equity and inclusion. It is our brand. It goes all the way back to the guy with no children saying, this is for the poor kids. It's just remarkable. We have a great history, great history, great history. Very proud of it. We have to be worthy of it.
Yeah, I think the thing that I so often think we don't say enough, and we should say it more in some ways, is that the purpose of education in the state of Ohio, the purpose of education in the city of Cincinnati, was truly focused on those who would otherwise never get that experience and
Right.
never get that knowledge. And that education was supposed to be a gateway to be able to do more. And so as we continue this process, as we continue education in our district here, we should be always focused on making sure that we give opportunities to those so they can do more and accomplish more. And that doesn't always mean do it the same way or do it the same thing, but it means for them to be able to leave our buildings with something better than they walked in with. And that's truly what we should be funding when it comes to education, is making sure that a child who comes through the system can leave the system in a better place than they were when they walked in, and leave our communities in a better place than when they entered them.
Here, here.
You're here. Wow,
We'll
thank
have
you.
to remember that as we start our third century.
That's right.
Yeah, so we need to decide when our third century starts.
That's true too.
And we
It's
need to go-
27.
We're gonna go 27. Now this was great. I think it's getting to wrap up here. So I want to thank our guests tonight, Dr. Fleeter and
Great
obviously
job.
General Counsel Poing. I mean, I think people, a ton of information tonight and really powerful information for us. And also want to thank, Ms. Bolton and Mr. Craig for being here. It's always great to have support of the board as a treasurer. It's, makes me feel all warm inside. But I think it's a great conversation. So hopefully, we'll go on to the next one. So join us next month, Wednesday, December 3rd, as we're going to discuss property taxes, and we will be joined by Hamilton County Auditor Jessica Miranda.
Awesome.
So good night, everyone.